that's a whole different story. And so I figured, since we all kind of come at this from different vantage points, if you will, it might not be a bad idea to just kind of go around and gather our first impressions about, well, what do we think is going on here? And then out of that, see if we can find a direction to pursue to clarify the unanswered questions, or the things that we're uncertain about, or because I'm not a Barfield expert either. I found myself rereading the book. So it's not the first time I read it, but I can't say that I'm a whole lot further than I was the first time I did. So, but then again, every time you read a book, it's a little different than the first time. So
I'll start.
good. I thought you would.
But I'm gonna what I like. What I like and what I don't like. Okay. What I like a lot about Barfield is his love of language, and the kind of odd, quirky, slip through the cracks kind of topics he seems to be interested in. So I find him a very attractive kind of companion. I read a biography about him this summer. That he is a student of Steiner attracts me as well, because I find it useful to understand Steiner. I go to Barfield. To understand Barfield, I go to someone like Jeremy Johnson or Mark Vernon. So I think there's a cluster of thinkers that require other thinkers, so that they can cross-fertilize and explicate in an author what was implicated. So I think this is what's interesting too about Barfield, is his relationships. He was in the Inklings, which was I think C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and this guy, Charles Williams. I'm just reading his novel. I've never heard of him before until I started to hear about the Inklings. I'm one of the only people in the world who hasn't read Tolkien, but I've seen all the movies. But I did read a little C.S. Lewis. But what interests me is although he never co-authored anything, and he did dabble in fiction and some poetry, but he basically wrote criticism, cultural criticism, I think. I think he was very collaborative. I think he was part of the Inklings there were oppositions, and strong ones, I understand, between him and C.S. Lewis, but they had great overlaps in a very deep respect for one another. So I found it very illuminating when I read his letters with Saul Bellows, the novelist, back in I think it was the late 70s, early 80s. I had some coffee brewing. But I was struck by the tone of these two letter writers, who are also very good writers, but when they wrote letters to one another, it's at another level. I mean, the elegance and the intensity and the exquisite courtesy that these two men displayed to one another in their letters is just staggering, because we don't have that anymore in the world of email. I think that's that kind of artistry in letter writing has vanished. And I think that that's what I like about him. I think he also intuited the postmodern malaise. I think at the end of the Second World War, it was happening, and I think I don't know if he read Gebser, but he certainly looks like he was working he was very familiar with the territory that I think Gebser was working in. So I guess what I find difficult about him is his prose is sometimes really, really knotty and thorny and convoluted, but I think that someone on YouTube created some vignettes, some illustrations, took a few vignettes from the text, and it's spoken out loud while there are drawings, of rainbows and and things like that, which are very amorphous and strange. Where exactly is a rainbow? And I think this is how he's drawing upon that Goethean kind of participatory science, which had been pretty much suppressed by scientism, scientific materialism, even to this day. It's deeply suppressed. So anyway, so that's my complaint, but it's a minor one compared to the enormous riches I think that he offers. And I've read three or four of his books. I hope I get a chance to read them all. I want to get to this one, History in English Words. I think this would be fun for us language geeks. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to how other people are meeting and greeting this author, if you haven't met him before. And if you have you learned something new from this this sort of brief entrance into this participatory final participation chapter? Thank you.
Don't all jump at once here. I'm going to go last.
Well, if you're going to go last, I'll jump. I don't, let me see. This is my introduction to Owen Barfield. I've come across his name a few times, probably through Jeremy's talks or writings. And so I'm just learning. I read the PDF that you shared on the forum topic for this talk, Ed. And I listened to most of Jeremy's talk with Vernon about Barfield and Gebser. I also picked up a couple of background books, just things that struck my fancy as I was in the library. One was a history of the Inklings, and focusing specifically on the four most famous members, Tolkien, Lewis, Barfield, and Williamson. Another one I haven't heard of, but the author of the book that John shared. And a little bit in that, and then another book I picked up called Imagination is Reality, and that subtitle Western Nirvana in Young Hillman Barfield and Cassirer by Robert Avens. And that was interesting too, just to give some perspective into maybe what are the intellectual connections that Barfield is a part of. Like John said, I think we encounter Barfield in the context of other thinkers, the Inklings being one of those groups, Steiner being, I guess, another one that he was particularly attracted to. C.S. Lewis didn't like that, apparently. C.S. Lewis thought Steiner was a fraud. And one interesting thing I've learned in the last few days is more about the Inklings and more about this intellectual group that was active between the two world wars in and around Oxford at that time, and how collaborative they were, how fervent they were, the artistry that they put into their relationships and into their discourse, I think was a big deal. And they were really, one of the points the author of this history makes is that they were very conscious of living in a time of crisis, a time of extremis, and preserving something, like going back into the history of Western culture, and one of whose founts, or one of whose kind of founding or shaping, let's say, influences is in the Oxford area, and the deep religious roots of that location. I didn't know that it had originally been composed of hermitages and monasteries, and there was it really started in, and the university tradition started in that scholastic and that theological milieu. So they were very much looking to, I think, ground themselves and ground the culture that they, I think, believed that they were representatives of, or exemplars of, even by going back to mythology, going back to religion, and the esoteric, that there's a long and deep history of Western esoterica coming out of Oxford, and this group in particular was very much in that lineage. They hated Bohemians. They were not countercultural. They were cultural, and I I think that that's probably what I wouldn't like, that I don't like, even though for us they're countercultural because we're steeped in scientific materialism. So they're very countercultural to that, but in a way that's in like oddly more conservative, perhaps, than maybe a contemporary exponent of esoteric consciousness studies might, I don't know, feel comfortable with. I think that comes through in the title of this piece, actually, Final Participation. It's so grim. I know that final has a philosophical meaning to it, going back to the Aristotelian theory of causation. But I think, as someone who is so sensitive to language, I don't believe that that would be the only meaning that would be intended. I think that that word "final" has a multivalent, multi-layered meaning that we can perhaps draw out. And I understand that in Barfield's theory, in his cosmology, final participation is contrasted with original participation, and that there's a movement, there's a historical and a spiritual movement going from one to the other. Original participation being the more or less equivalent to Gebser's origin or archaic structures, how I would understand it, is non-reflective or pre-reflective being in the world. Whereas final participation comes at the end of an arc that traverses the emergence of self-reflexivity and the ego and the mental structure. And final participation would be, see, I don't think Barfield has as perhaps fine, I don't, from the little I see here, not as detailed maybe and narrative around this as Gebser does with the multiple structures, not as structured a narrative perhaps, but the final participation would be equivalent more or less to the integral that includes, as he writes here, the whole man, thought, feeling, will, and character, and being an integrated, self-reflexive inclusive, but not stuck in self-reflexivity, not stuck in mental egoity, able to be holistic, and at the same time, inclusive of all that has emerged from that original latency. I think the emphasis on participation is really resonant. That I think is the kind of cosmology that we're still learning. That is to say, a non-detached cosmology, a cosmology where nirvana or enlightenment or the telos is to be found in the world rather than in something that's other than the world, in a pure transcendence. So in that sense, I think it's kind of a completion of the whole axial age turning, in so far as we get a transcendent move in the axial age, and then in an integral age we have a sort of immanence with that combines an immanence and transcendence both, a transcendence, an immanent transcendence, or transcend whatever. I mean, that's probably the other thing I don't like as much about this piece, is that it's more kind of clunky and conceptual. Beta I don't know what beta thinking is. There's some terminology here that I think is less than intuitive. Potential, phenomenal, like that kind of thing. It's more mental. But I welcome the introduction. I'm happy to learn more, and I'm curious what others think and what they've learned. So thanks.
Jeffrey, why don't you go? I want to go last.
Okay.
I want to be last.
Okay, I'll step in. I really don't have a very. I have an entry point, I think, into Barfield, rather than any kind of. So I read the whole chapter 20, but it's like he's talking about concepts through the, you know, Goethe and Steiner and these different references that he uses. But if you don't understand the concept to begin with, he can talk about Goethe and Steiner all you like, but you have no sense of what he's really trying to say. So I found it very difficult to unpack what was going on in the chapter. I could kind of get a sense about this participation, original participation, final participation. But even the term final participation doesn't really speak to me. So I have difficulty with this. But when I turn to the other thing, the excerpts that explain the different terms, it was the opening paragraph that spoke to me. So I'm going to read it. When a lady complained to Whistler that she did not see the world he painted, he is said to have replied, "No, ma'am, but don't you wish you could?" Both Whistler and the lady were really referring to that activity, which in Whistler's case was intenser than the lady's. This is very like Barfield's way of writing. He doesn't say what activity, he just says that activity, and you're supposed to infer what he means from what he says. Ought it to be called a mental activity? Whatever it ought to be called, it really is the percipient's own contribution to the representation. It is all that in the representation which is not sensation. For as the organs of sense are required to convert the unrepresented particles into sensations for us, so something is required in us to convert sensations into things. It is this something that I mean, and it will avoid confusion if I purposely choose an unfamiliar and little used word and call it, at the risk of infelicity, figuration. So I relate to that. I relate to this because representation, as you probably know, is not something that I cleaved to for the first 25 years of my career, and have since moved towards more a rejection of representation, or a rethinking of what, a relativization of representation. At first I thought of it as the be-all and end-all of cognition, but today I think of representation as a very small piece of a much bigger puzzle. And so this idea that it's not just about something in the world, but something that we bring to the world, that I can relate to. And I guess that's part of what he's getting at with this idea of participation. I didn't listen to the interview with Jeremy. I will go and do that after we have this discussion. But so I really feel I don't have, I mean, I am aware of the inklings. I kind of think that what we do here is a kind of an inkling-like activity at Infinite Conversations in a kind of way. So I have some resonances with that, but I'm not Christian. So, C.S. Lewis was deeply religious. Tolkien was religious in a kind of half-hidden way behind his work. He doesn't actually, sometimes I find, I mean, in C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, the religion is pretty obvious. But in Tolkien's work, it's not so obvious. It's there, but it's muted. And I find that interesting about Tolkien, that it is transformed in some way. But how that all relates to Barfield, at this point, I really have no idea. Except it's clear that these people, men, I guess, had a common understanding of the world that drove much of their writings in these different areas. And so that's interesting. That interests me, to try and understand that a bit more. So I'm not going to say much more. I'm not feeling well, and I don't really want to participate too much by speaking. I've already learned a lot just from listening to you guys. So I expect to learn more in the next little while.
So I'm kind of like a lot of what I hear is that I'm new to Barfield. My interest comes from just the love of language. Anybody that loves language and has something to say about language and how it participates in our life. And so some of the ways that I read them, I read the pieces and listened to Jeremy, and I read Vern's book and that, and I guess my background is that I just read what I'm interested in, and I don't store a lot of this or that, but I know what I'm interested in. And one thing in Barfield on the participation, in the last paragraph, he said something that to me represents, and I agree with Marco, how he framed the notion of final and stuff. But in the last paragraph, he says the way out may still lie through and not back. And that to me signifies this notion to participate. We can't go back in the sense of maybe a disassociated detachment from what is happening here and now. You know, a disassociated detachment versus a detachment that participates and looks at how our own concepts, our own ways of knowing and being are influencing the way we're even participating in life. And language is a big part of that. I was touched personally because of my issues around language. And another thing I read of his on Philos and Incarnation, where he describes that historically, and his way of looking at words, and this is just my rough, raw sketch, that the way he looked at the history of how words came about and how we drew on the environment to create words and our association, that same phenomenon, or whatever you want to call it, takes place when a child learns language and then is trying to make sense of the environment that he's living in learning how to speak and use language. I was very impacted by that, because that has left a deep imprint in my love of language, but also my fucking hate of it sometimes when in the past people refuse to listen or give me space to try to articulate like you gentlemen are doing with me now. So I kind of come at this whole approach with Barfield through that experience that I've had with language and how to participate in the environment I live in. So that's the best I can do, guys.
I don't think it's ever a matter of the best or the worst or whatever. We have to say what we say, or we say what we have to say, or we don't say it. We can also just sit on it. Like I mentioned right at the beginning, I think it is a little and Vernon certainly didn't mean it in any ill way. It was a little misleading to think that you can just jump into something like Barfield's thought in the middle and just swim merrily along, because he's as Johnny had pointed out, it's naughty prose because there's some naughty thinking going on in there, and it's very. When I was leafing back through the chapter again, I was struck by how many intertextual references he has to himself. As I said in chapter 13, as I went over in chapter 10, and as it was in, those chapters, and then he footnote that dashboard knowledge, which is why I included it. And he assumes a lot of his readers, because he's, as I think is also the general feeling here, that group of folks between the wars in Oxon up there, that axis, the Oxford-Cambridge axis, they were people who were much differently educated than we are today. You notice when he's, if you read the other parts of the book, if you actually read the whole book, it's amazing how often he's talking about, Marco did bring this up with how they went from potentia to possibilis to, well, they're just mere words and it really doesn't matter by the time Bacon came around. And there is this really deep understanding of the original text. He talks a lot in other parts of the book about the nuances in the Greek texts that have simply been glossed over in the meantime. There was many points when I was going through and reading it again where I had to think of Collingwood, who was, in his autobiography, talks about his first days at Oxford, where he went to his tutor, and his tutor said, well, why don't you write a paper, which is basically how studying happened back then. You met with your tutor, and your tutor told you to go write a paper. And so you went off and read and wrote a paper and came back, and then you discussed that with your tutor. That's kind of how studying went. In Britain, people don't say, well, I studied something at university. They usually say, I read philosophy at Oxford, or I read history at Cambridge, or whatever. Because that's mostly what they did, is they read. But Collingwood was reading the Greeks in Greek, and Barfield's one of those as well. He's that classical scholar. He has a very firm understanding of Latin. He knows his Greek inside out. He understands and can read Hebrew. That's the classical education. I think we've mentioned a couple of times in some of our cafes. It was just kind of a given, and folks who do that approach their worlds much differently than we do today. We're all post-war, and we're all in that very staid and fast materialistic science that Marco had also pointed out. That's kind of like our starting point, and it's very hard for us, I think, sometimes to get a feel. We all appreciate it. We all go, well, the language is kind of nice, and he's telling us things that I really hadn't thought about before, and it kind of opens up new vistas, but it does make it hard to understand, on the other hand, what it is that he's actually going about. One of the things that I think distinguishes Barfield from Gapeser is he's only looking at the development of consciousness, or the history of consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, from the Greeks onward. And he said, because his point, his big point, I think, and he repeats it a lot of times throughout the book, is most people today, and I think this was true for his time as well, believe very firmly that the first human beings who ever appeared were like us. They thought like us, they felt like us, they looked like us. Oh, they might have been a little hairier than we are, but for the most part, that hasn't changed very much. And his big point is to make people aware of they're actually nothing like us. on the inside at all. And we need to recognize that difference because things have changed, and they've changed significantly, and they haven't stopped changing. Now, whereas Gapes tried to put together an entire, whatever it is, for all of humanity for, throughout the course of its whole history, Barfield was very interested in pointing out that if you recognize what's going on, then you will know that before that it was even different, more different, whatever that might be. But he's not going to go through and analyze that. That's why his original participation, I think, kind of covers everything from archaic up through the mythical. Because he says right up until the Middle Ages, in another part of the book, there was still a lot of original participation going on. He says about the Middle Ages itself, this is right prior to the scientific revolution, prior to the discovery of perspective, which he also highlights in another part of the book, where we really started thinking or approaching or perceiving the world more like we do today. That was all going away, that original participation. He says, medieval man, or the person of the Middle Ages, wore his environment like a cloak, whereas we look upon it as it's something outside of us and divorced from us and separate from us. So we view it in a detached manner, whereas they were still immersed in it. And that makes all the difference in the world and how you perceive and understand reality and what reality might have to offer. And so this whole idea, I found it very interesting. He's writing in 1957 before constructivism in psychology was even a flash in anyone's mind. And he's talking about how, in a sense, and when we read this now, let's say post 2000, we kind of get a different understanding, or we may misinterpret what he's actually trying to say in how we construct reality. The rainbow is his classic example. John had mentioned that as well, where, does the rainbow exist if nobody looks at it? Is it even there if no one can see it? We know that light shines and reflects, but in relation to what or to whom? And his whole point is that if there's not a person or a conscious, I'll put it that way, a consciousness to see it, he doesn't want to go into what this might mean for animals, then it probably doesn't exist. But he also implies in that all of the phenomenon that the science thinks happens in the course of the development of the Earth itself, that didn't exist either, at least not in the way that we think it did. We don't know what the world looked like to dinosaurs because we're not dinosaurs. And if we were there, it would look differently, or it would be different because we're also participating. And that's the thing that I find so fascinating. There is that notion of participating. And what struck me in reading this chapter is how he never says participating in. He says we participate reality, almost like we precipitate reality that's around us, which I think has a much subtler but impactful nuance to it, because he leaves out that preposition. So there's an act that we do, all of us as human beings, that kind of constitutes reality as we know it. And it's not as divorced from us as we would like to think. So he has a theory of, I don't want to limit it to perception, but it's kind of like a theory of perception that is extremely far-reaching in and of itself. And it carries with it serious consequences. And what he tries to do is point out that through primarily language and texts, how that has been evidenced throughout at least this period where we have well-documented evidence, because we have a lot of texts from the Greeks up until now, of how you can trace this development and how it has changed along the way. Because it's important for him, for folks to realize that we haven't always been like we are today. Ancient man or prehistorical man or the ancient Hebrews did not perceive or apperceive or prehend the world like we do. It was a different world for them. It was a different reality. But that's also, I think, one of the implications that Gapser has as well, is it is a different reality. And we are now at a point where this is about to take another step. This final participation, which is, does it mean last, or is it in that Aristotelian sense of like final cause kind of thing, which is not final. It's that's you know, it's something not as how do I say this? It's not ultimate. I don't think it's the last step. It's just the step for now. It could be something different beyond that. Now, having said all of that, well, first of all, did anyone besides me get a feeling for that this also has something to do with how we engage and how we understand reality? I think that's one of the key factors, because I think that's something that he's actually trying to emphasize at some point. He wants that to become clear. Our scientific friends, our scientific materialistic friends wouldn't see it that way, because they've even sloughed off consciousness itself. But he says that reality can't exist without that consciousness that's there, which is, I don't think it's something he explicitly states, but it's something that he implies very strongly. So we'll put it that way.
Michael, did you want to go?
Well, do you mind, John?
No, go.
Do you mind if I go first? Okay. You know, it's probably just going to be obvious, yes. From my point of view, yeah, we do engage, we do participate. I haven't read enough Barfield to understand what that means to him, but in reading him, he validates what it means to me, is that how I participate is based on multiple factors of how I've learned to feel reality, how I've learned to picture reality, how I've come to interact reality. And there's a place to participate that I've learned through meditation to just sit my ass on the cushion and participate by sitting down and being with, but it's a delusion that I'm not participating. It's a complete delusion that I'm not participating. It's just, how am I participating? So that comes from what I've learned of the value and the kind of participation I feel both Owen Barfield and Gepser are at least giving some kind of working possible model for.
That was great. Thank you all. This is a lot of fun for me, because you know, I've read these books, you know, in my private study and struggled with them, and enjoyed immensely some of it, and was baffled by a great deal of it. But many persons that I respected kept pointing to Barfield as a very pivotal figure. And so I persevered, and I'm glad that I have. I think if you haven't seen the Mark Vernon interview with Jeremy, do that before you read any further of Barfield, because I think he does a splendid job of making all these ambiguities and, you know, this Oxford Don kind of pretentiousness, it seems to me. Very priggish, very Edwardian gentlemen sipping their tea and ringing the bell so the servant can come clear off things. I think that's the kind of atmosphere that these intellectuals were working with a different kind of dynamic than we are. I think that's interesting, though, to go back and imagine what it must have been like before feminism and sex, drugs, rock and roll, the gay movement, the civil rights movement had even started. That's when these men had reached their maturity at the end of the First World War, and they went through the Second World War. Barfield was lucky enough to live into, I think he was in his 90s, and he was interviewed by Gary Lockman for his, one of the last interviews I think he gave. Gary Lockman, we may know as a contemporary student of occulture. But I think that all of you have touched on something that I think resonates. This chapter, I think, is probably a bit too compressed, because he's in this final participation chapter, he's already offering a summary of things that he's developed previously. So it's a little tricky if you don't know what he's been developing to quite catch it, because it's very compressed chapter, unlike his other ones, which are very long and with lots of arguments. But I think that the idea here of the rainbow, it's the opening metaphor he uses, is that, okay, we just have a rainbow. We're looking at a rainbow. Where is the rainbow? Is it in the clouds? Is it in the rain? Is it in the eye of the beholder? Is it in the eyes of multiple beholders? And that's very ambiguous, where that rainbow is. The same thing could be said of a tree. And I think that's where so he uses the rainbow example, and then he goes and talks about trees and flowers and rocks, and, you know, consensus reality is made up of things that we can all point to and agree, yes, and we have a name for it. And we have verbs and we have nouns. But he's saying that, and I think you touched on this, Ed, too, that the, I'm hoping I'm losing my thought here, because this is very, very slippery stuff. That the garment, that to the participatory, original participation, for the vast majority that humans have been on this planet, they were embedded in nature. They were not, there was no separation between themselves and nature. They were embedded in it, and it was a garment. It was much more like a garment that they wear than something that they could objectify. I'm over here, you're over there. There's the tree. I'm over here observing the tree. I am the subject, that is the object. That was not something that he's claiming those who are embedded in nature, in the magical, and what Gibbs would call, I think, the magical and the archaic, they were not able to separate themselves. There was participatory, it was relational. An aspect of their nature was the tree. And that's why, and they were in a telepathic rapport with other than human. And if you think about this, at the beginning of literacy, Homer was a poet. He comes from an oral tradition. He didn't write anything down, but evidently his thought, someone, when writing came along, started to write down what these Homeric poets were performing in public spaces. And we notice that there's a difference in the literary and the literal and the linguistic minds than what was happening in the poetry that was oral. And he wrote a review. It's on that website. About I can't remember the title of it. Something about the bicameral mind. It was real classic. Does anyone know that book? Do you know the title of it?
Yeah, that was the Origins of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian James.
Julian James. So he writes a review of that, and he appreciates that book, but he also criticizes it a great deal. But I think what's interesting is that, for instance, a character like Helen, who you know, she's a married woman. Paris, who's a Trojan, right? He's visiting. Her husband's Agamemnon, the king. and she's the queen. And behind her husband's back, she enters into a sexual relationship with Paris, and he takes her off back to Troy. This angers Agamemnon, and it begins the Trojan War. So he is the brother of Menelaus, I believe, and they start a campaign. And these are tribal chieftains, and others owe allegiance to them, so they demand to protect preserve the honor of is it Menelaus or Agamemnon? I'm confused. But to preserve the honor, they go off and are justified in creating this war against the Trojans. It was a disaster for Troy. They lose. Troy is burnt to the ground. All the women are enslaved and are dragged off to other places as concubines. Interestingly enough, Helen goes back to live with Agamemnon. I'm sorry, it may not be Agamemnon. I think it's Menelaus. They're brothers, Agamemnon and Menelaus.
Yeah, it's Menelaus.
Menelaus.
Yeah.
Agamemnon gets murdered by his wife when he returns. That's Clytemnestra and Agamemnon. But Helen, who was sisters, by the way, to Clytemnestra, what a family. But anyway, she goes back, lives happily ever after with her husband. So the question is, how could a woman who by our standards, by most modern standards, behaved so abominably, who started this enormous human tragedy, live happily ever after with the man she betrayed? And this is something that I think it's the psychology of these persons, and they had their codes, and they had their sense of honor, and they had a sense of what is right and wrong, but it was dictated often by a god or a goddess who was working through them, and they were not held responsible for that. So Helen was just doing what Aphrodite wanted her to do, or what Venus, the goddess of love, had an itch, and she wanted some human to scratch it. So she zapped the human with her intent, and created this scenario. So I think this is also what the whole idea of they were hearing voices in their heads. This is the bicameral mind. And I think it was sort of, Julian Jaynes was sort of hypothesizing that they were like modern day schizophrenics. And I think this is what Barfield objected to in James's account of these Homeric, the peoples who came out of these Homeric visions, these oral people who were embedded in nature. They had not had that sense of separation. And their language, if you read Homer, it's a totally different register from ours. And none of the Homeric characters like Achilles and Agamemnon, they don't have the kind of, or Odysseus, I think, is on the edge of a different kind of mentality, but they don't have the depth or the complexity of a Medea or an Electra, or in those late plays of Euripides, somewhat in Sophocles. But if you look at the drama, in Greek drama, you see these were literate people already, but they were creating characters that came out of an ancient mythology that they all shared, but they are adding something to those characters, and it has a lot to do with complexity and depth that a literate culture is able to track in an individual, and then externalize that in a way that an oral tradition is not able to do, because they can't write things down and take a meta perspective and say, I don't think I quite got it right. I think I'm going to rewrite that and do that differently. The actors in the Greek theater were given a script and they memorized it. So this is written speech that is performed, but it has a different character, a different quality than than those Homeric oral tradition had. So I'm just doing this as a little background, because for those of you who are a little perplexed, I share that perplexity with you. But I think these are, if you've read these plays and you've read Homer, and you think about the modern mind and how it's so different from them, but not that different. We can identify and relate to these characters. But I think that as we're moving into the modern, and we've eliminated the transcendent, and we moved into the postmodern with its increasing despair over any truth whatsoever, we're in this post-truth dilemma right now. I think we're working these things out. There is, I think, a need to reconstruct rather than continually, perpetually deconstruct. And this is where this participatory, final participation, I think, is being sponsored by Barfield. And I think the Gebser went even further, and I think Jeremy Johnson is even going further, as is Mark Vernon. So I think that this is just getting started. This final participation, the aperspectival, the integral, the emergent, the new axial age, whatever you want to call it. I think we're starting to realize how we're hardwired for transcendence. And if we try to eliminate transcendence from our vocabulary, we're going to need lots of drugs and lots of money to go shopping to distract ourselves from this gaping void. And anyway, there's more than I could say, but that I think addresses something of what you said, Michael, about meditation. And forgive me for being so long-winded here. It's sort of hard to put all these ideas together. But I just wanted to quote very briefly a lover of Barfield, and that's William Irwin Thompson. And I think this may help, this brief quote. He's talking about dogs, humans, and birds. He says, dogs have two cones as photoreceptors, and thus have two-dimensional color vision, the black and white world of perception in full moonlight. Primates and humans have three cones, and thus have the world we know as colored. But birds have four types of receptors, and therefore experience a world we can only imagine. So it makes little sense to think that there is one single and objective world in which we all live. We do not see the space of the world. We live our field of vision. We do not see the colors of the world. We live our chromatic space. And he goes on to imagine what that bird with those four types of receptors is perceiving. I won't go into his description because it's too trippy. Anyway, I hope that stirs up something among all of you, and I'm really welcoming this opportunity to attempt an integration of all that I've read, and you know, to sort of get it out into a social space, because I think this is where these ideas belong. I think as we make these transitions, this huge transition, we need to look at those who were, you know, very conservative thinkers. Definitely the Inklings were. And when I look at Barfield talking about the beginnings of the gay movement and the feminist movement, he's so snarky. You know, he's such a snob, and he's so tight-assed. And I don't think he got it at all, what the gay movement was all about. Not that there weren't gay people or queers back in those days. There were, and I'm sure he knew lots of them, but they were discreet, you know, like Oscar Wilde, who of course wasn't discreet. But there was an unspokenness about all that kind of stuff. But we've spoken, and we've made we have expressed our desires. And I think desire is really what final participation is about. It's not about solving a problem that's pre-given. It's not about seeking for a solution. It's about what do you want and what needs to happen to make that happen. And I think that is what final participation is all about, because when you know what you desire and you get clear about what you desire, you then can stop acting out the pseudo desires of late stage capitalism with all the running around and shopping and getting into drugs and alcohol and all that stuff that distracts people, because they, you know, they're duped into thinking that these pseudo desires that the consumer economy demands us to buy is all that they are. So anyway, that's why I think it's important to study Barfield, because I think he's creating the conditions for reaping some of, I think, what's happening now with our the malaise and the disappointment. And also, we can, I think, get better at articulating this, looking at our desire structure and what we really want, rather than just trying to go for what we're told we can have. This endless menu, this is what you can have, but I don't want that. It doesn't matter, that's all there is. And my response to that has been, fuck you. I'm gonna go out and get what I want. That doesn't mean I got everything I want, but at least I have a direction. And I think that's what he's offering here, is that there is a direction to your desire. It's not coming from nowhere. So thanks for giving me a chance to sort of articulate this. It's not easy. Thanks.
Sorry, John, can you repeat William Irwin Thompson, is it? But what was the book?
It's a lovely book. He's talking about myth and science, imaginary landscapes, making worlds. We're making worlds of myth and science. No, yeah, making worlds of myth and science. William Irwin Thompson. It's a short book and it's extremely readable. And he's drawing on Gebser and Barfield and a whole lot more. Thanks.
So could we review Aristotle's theory of causation? I should know this as a philosophy student, but I think I might be a little bit rusty because final cause is one of the causes. There's the efficient cause, which is kind of how a thing comes into being. There's the help me out here. there's the formal cause, the material cause, and the formal cause, and the final cause. The final cause is the why. So if you're creating a hammer, it's to hammer nails. That's the final cause. The purpose, if it's an eyeball, it's to see, right? And
if it's a house, it's to live in a house. You need shelter. But what makes a house is wood and metal, and that's material. Carpenters and construction workers. I guess that would be
the efficient cause.
That's the efficient cause. The blueprint
mm-hmm.
that the architect makes, that's the formal cause.
Correct. Yes.
So you have all of those different causes. I think that's the Aristotelian model, the basic Aristotelian model. And I think science takes care of efficient and material. That's the only causes they recognize, really. They're against final cause. Because they don't want anyone instrumentalized in postmodern. And that's a very legitimate thing. Black people are out there to do the hard, heavy lifting. That's what they're for. That's their final cause. And we can all see the abuses that some people have used final cause. They've done with that. Or same thing with women. You know, women are to make babies, you know, or to decorate the house, or to be charming. Charming hostesses. That's what a woman is for. So I think that's why a lot of people object to that final cause. But I don't think that's what, I may be wrong, I don't think that's what Barfield is, how he's using it.
Well, I'm curious how he's using it, because I hear that Aristotelian teleological implication to the word, that there's something purposeful about this kind of participation. And so there's an intentionality there, which may not be there in original participation when things are just happening. I went off with the handsome king from Troy because I was struck by Athena's, or the god, or Aphrodite's arrow, or something like that. With final participation, there's an author. There's a self who can have an intention and who could want something, who can desire a particular outcome for themselves. But I'm curious about what the theological aspect of this is, because in the larger Christian worldview, there's a final cause which has to do with God's plan. It has to do with His desire for humanity, and humanity fulfilling that design. And the final part being perhaps related to an eschatological dimension of, what is to come, what is the fulfillment of history, and also in relation to Christ, the figure, the Messiah figure, who initiates this kind of movement from original to final. So this being a fulfillment of that of that movement. And so this is just what I'm drawing on it, but the part that I think is most interesting to me is the aspect of imagination and the role that imagination plays in this, because when we have another mindful AI here, I think that's Doug, because there's a dialogue happening here in the move from a Cartesian kind of cosmology and epistemology to a Kantian one, where what is perceived is seen to be generated by the subject. It's like an interpretation of the noumenon, of the thing in itself. We don't see the thing in itself. We see the thing for us because of the structures of our consciousness. And in Kant, there was space and time. That's something about us. That's something about the subject. And then there are what he calls categories of the understanding, which have to do with how we structure experience. So we experience things in a sequence of A, B, and C, and we, Kant says, apply the categories of causation. So we say that A causes B causes C, but that's not necessarily in the thing itself. That's something that we have to deduce, because otherwise experience wouldn't make any sense. And participation then is a way of rethinking, like, that what in the Cartesian worldview is the mirror of nature. It's the naive realism of a world existing independently of ourselves as perceivers, and then us beholding that world and describing it, representing it. So that's the representation piece. What's different about this notion of imagination is that it's not just that we're imagining things like in like the distinction between fantasy or fancy, as the Oxford crew put it, and imagination. Imagination is active even deeper than that. It's deeper in structuring time and space itself. So the way that we experience things in time and space is already an act of imagination. And what I think is the connection point with the purposefulness is that we can, if we stand inside of that that active space, that we can restructure things, like we can change things from the inside. We're not just reflecting or operating on them from the outside. So I think that that's really interesting. And to me, this is much more kind of in the spirit of William Blake and of Milton, of some of the other visionary poets who we've been reading, who are not just, I think, creating works of literature that are in the same spirit and the same kind of cultural milieu as what's around them, but are actually recasting their culture through the force of their imagination. Like, how do we know how a bird sees? We can only know that through imagination, through the active imagination of entering into the perceptual being of the bird. And that's very interesting to me, because that, I think, opens up a lot of possibilities that are not there if you just have to choose from a menu of what's available to you, as a human with a pre-established or prepackaged purpose.
That was great, Marco. Thank you. And I hope Ed will pitch in here and help me out a little bit, because I think that final participation and Aristotle's idea of final cause and how that has been used is subtly different. I think C.S. Lewis was was an Orthodox Christian in a way. I remember reading, he said about praying, "Oh, make me chaste, O Lord, but not yet." This is a young man praying. I think that's the only thing I really remember about that book on C.S. Lewis wrote. I know he wrote some novels, but I think he was a very Orthodox Anglican, and I don't think Barfield was. I think he was he was thinking of final participation as the resurrection, but a very different kind of resurrection. It's about the return of that original participation. Added to it, the depth and the dimension that comes from the modern mind. Yes, Kant separated. You cannot know the thing in self. All you can know is the way your system constructs, and you're the subject. And there's a transcendental subject. So the subject is outside of nature and can do with it what he or she will, you know. And I think that's the downside of modernism and the alienation that goes with it, that kind of separation, which was very foreign to the prehistoric. And I think, but now we have a chance to experience that return. And it's not a return to a Christian orthodoxy, which has ethical rules pre-given that you have to subscribe to be a good Christian. And one of them is you have to believe in Jesus, that he's going to save you from your sin. I don't think Barfield was interested in that at all. I think he's talking about something, if you'll pardon me for quoting again from this, unless Ed help me out here. I'm not that big in, I'm not sure about the ontology here, or I mean about the theology that Barfield espouses, but I definitely get the feeling that he's doing something very different from what C.S. Lewis was doing.
I would agree that he is, but we'll take a little step back. When they first met, it's my understanding, I might be wrong, that Lewis was an atheist. And at some point, he converted and he became Christian. And like you say, John, I think he was a very Orthodox Anglican. Or, yeah, Anglican is what they are in England. They're Episcopalians in America. Okay, so he becomes this very Orthodox Christian. And everything goes according to that dogmatic structure. And he argues with the fervor of the convert. I think that's the other thing about Lewis. He is so strongly, such a strong advocate of this because he believes he's found the answer, which is what happens when a lot of people convert. So we have that. When you read the last chapters of Saving the Appearances, and this was the thing, you know, like the question keeps coming up, well, why doesn't Gapser know anything about Barfield, or why don't they reference each other? They were contemporaries. Why is there no interaction? But when you look in the back of the book where they help the librarians decide where to file the thing and what Dewey Decimal number to give it to them. This one is philosophy/religion. And as it turns out, he has a chapter entitled Religion. And his focus in Saving the Appearance is an extremely religious one. This is something that Gapser wasn't. He was subtly. There's a spiritual underpinning, and there was this background, but he was very indirect about emphasizing that. You know, he said it a couple of places, you know, origin, it's spiritual and this, that, and whatnot. And he's kind of unabashedly that way, but he's not loudly unabashedly that way. He's very subtle in that regard. Whereas Barfield takes a different stance. Now, he does have a very, very close relationship to Steiner, we'll get to, I think, and we have to look at that in a moment as well. But in these last chapters, Marco had mentioned the axial age in there. And one of the things in the Jasperian view of that, and one of the things we wrestled with in our group, was this idea that it was subtly, although everybody tried to push it back further into the Greek geographical domain, the underlying and unspoken belief was it is because Jesus appeared and the world is no longer the way it was before. That is the definite marking point between pre-axial and post-axial. And it's kind of hidden underneath it all. That's why in the first chapters of the axial age and its consequences, Joas and help me out. Don't get old, guys. Don't get old. Bella. Reading this guy for months. Now I can't remember his name. I went on to this. They were, the first couple of essays are all about the religiosity of the axial age. For them, it was a religious phenomenon. But nobody wanted to actually come out and say openly, well, that's where history was going. That's where, when Eve bit into the apple and gave it to Adam, that's where we were headed. We were headed for Jesus showing up. And that's something that Barfield does say. He is, in a lot of things that he says, exceedingly orthodox in his views. And this general understanding of if there is some kind of a teleological underpinning to this, that's a part of it, which is, on the one hand, a little bit surprising considering his relationship to Steiner. That's why I want to come back to that. But Steiner himself was a different kind of Christian. He was a different kind of Christian. He had little left for dogma, the orthodox view of things. You have to say this creed and you'll get into heaven kind of thing. He was going about this in an entirely different way, that's for sure. But most of the imagery that he uses is Christian. And one of the key meditative exercises that he has is the meditation of the Rosy Cross, and all of that Rosy Cross imagery is fundamentally Christian as well, in the sense that it is in some way, shape, or form, say, Christ-centric, whatever the understanding of Christ may be in that instance, because that's what varies across. If you go through the fundamentalists, that's one of the things that varies a great deal, and that was actually the root of the heretical persecutions as well. Was Jesus a man? Was Jesus human? Was he, we ended up with this, he's fully human, he's fully divine. What does that mean? There was a lot of mental gymnastics that were going on about that, trying to come to terms and make clear what and how he was. And when you look at the early stages of Christianity, now we've talked about the Gnostics, but if you go back before that, the Nestorians and the other heretics that have been completely eliminated, they had greatly differing views on the nature and the constitution and the person of Jesus himself. That was the basis of their belief system, and they coexisted. Origen actually belonged to them. He was almost banned completely. That that he survived as much as he has is actually quite remarkable, considering the turn that the church took once it became an institutionalized quasi-governmental organization with the support of the state kind of thing. So there were, those are all unresolved issues that are now, I think, somewhat reflected in the Lewis-Barfield's debate. And of course, Lewis would consider Steiner a charlatan and a heretic, actually, because he's saying things about Jesus that can't be true, because that's not the orthodox, that's not the party line kind of thing, which Lewis would be. But Barfield is making another case, but it becomes a very central part, I think, or is a central part in what's motivating him to get us to become aware of the fact that we do see the world much differently than our predecessors did. And we are going to see it differently, or we're in the process of seeing it differently in the future. One of the things that he did bring out, and I think it was in this chapter, where he says it's that interaction between the conscious and the unconscious. And it's in that interaction that reality actually comes about. And for the original participation, it was more unconscious than conscious. But what we're going through now with final participation is it should be more conscious than unconscious. So we need to bring things, Gapser would say we have to concretize, we have to bring into awareness, we have to intensify our consciousness to the degree that we can do certain things. So there is a certain affinity between Gapser's etiology, for example, being in truth, and what I think Barfield's pointing at with his final participation. Though I'm not, this is one of those books I hate, you know, you've said it yourself, John, you kind of fight your way through this and you think you come to some kind of understanding, but it's really helpful if you can sit down and kick those ideas around with other people that have looked at the same thing and said, well, I saw it a little differently than that, or I'm getting a different nuance there, because that helps to clarify that. Because it struck me again how struck I was when I read the final chapters, everything that comes after 20 in this book. And it's because it kind of shifts a lot of the things that he's saying up until then, because he's giving it a more particular focus than I would expect up until that point. It turns very Christ-centric. It turns very religious in that sense, whatever that might mean. But then I don't know enough about him to make a judgment. That is merely my own reaction, personal reaction, and sensitivity, whatever it is that I read there. So that, that's play a role in this. It would be something worth looking at. But the imagination as that active awareness part, and that's where I see imagination is a conscious act. We heighten that awareness. We desire, will, character, all of those things that we would expect, and that's where I see the parallels to Gapser and his integral structure of consciousness. All of those are present, and imagination becomes the key tool in order to effect that. And so, but what does that mean? I'm not clear on that yet, because it's one of those terms now that's being bantered about a lot. Well, if we use our imagination, we can. And Connolly talks about it in his book, where on the going planetary, where the imagination has to be more. But what he's saying by imagination is not necessarily, or maybe it is, and I just don't understand it, what I hear Lachman talking about when he talks about imagination, or when Barfield talks about imagination. So we've got the word running around, and I think it's getting filled in different ways that are overlapping, probably to a great extent, but I'm sure that there's subtle differences as well that may be worth noting at the same time. So that's just an addendum to what you were saying.
Marco, did you want to go?
Well, I guess I want to ask, what is imagination?
I have
I'd
an
like
answer.
to ask that. I do also want to point to a distinction that Barfield makes in this chapter between potential existence and phenomenal existence. That has something to do with this whole question, I think, as well. And the difference between that, seeing a kind of emergence from potential to actual, versus the categories of being and not being as like logical mental categories. And something also there's I'm just trying to piece this together as well, but the relation with Goethe and his participatory science, and how there's a very, I think, significant difference between those modes. Maybe imagination has something to do with that. And again, imagination not just as fancy or fantasy, but as an active, powerful, like cosmic force, actually.
If I might just step in, I don't have a lot to say about what imagination is, but one of the things that has struck me in my evolving understanding of these questions is that, because we used to think of imagination as imaging, as a kind of image that you held in your mind, the idea of a mind's eye, and you held these images in your mind's eye. And one of the things that came out of one of the positive things that came out of cognitive science in the last 20 years is that the process of mental imagery is a process, not a representation. So even though we believe or we fool ourselves into thinking we are holding these images in our mind, that's not actually what's going on. What is going on is we are using the perceptual machinery of the body, the processes. So that, for instance, when we imagine an image, our eyes actually scan the image. But the point is, it's the scanning that matters, not the image. So in a sense, we are reproducing an image through an act or process of scanning that we are doing in a kind of a mentally parallel way. So we're not actually holding an image. What we are doing is reproducing a process that regenerates an image using the machinery of perception in this way. So it is a process that's very active, not at all passive. So it doesn't, this is mental imagery, not imagination, but there is a clear link between the two effects. And even cognitive scientists are kind of stuck with this because they're still stuck on the idea of representation, but mental imagery is not about representation. It's about reproducing the processes. And so even there, they're kind of, it has this odd role within cognitive science where, in a way, the consequences of this way of understanding the world haven't really fully taken hold, even within the science community. Anyway, I think it's an interesting and useful way of thinking about this. And I'm not saying there isn't something else going on, but I do think it is a way of thinking about image forming that is interesting.
Well, I think that's a huge topic, Jeffrey. And I can work with what you say, but I have a hard time with the word machinery. And I think Barfield would as well. I think there's a difference. And where is that I, E-Y-E, that can scan the image? I think the third eye, which is a metaphor that we're all pretty much familiar with, and the outside sun, right? And then there's I close my eyes and have a dream, and I'm walking down a street and I can see the sun. What is my relationship to that interior and that exterior? And I think that's pretty crucial for us. What's inside and what's outside, what's interior, what's exterior, what's objective, what is subjective. I think once you drop the Kantian categories and look at the I, we, it kind of dynamic, I think Marco is very familiar with this in integral theory. I think we can appreciate, yes, the brain does something, but it's not what necessarily the subjective mind is doing. We're not separate, but we are different in how we perceive. And as Peter Kingsley said, this is a couple of, I don't know when we discussed him, a month or so ago. He says the senses, there's a gap that happens in the in-between, the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic, the smell, the touch. And in that gap, if you're attuned and you're subtle enough to register it, you can go in the in-between to eternity. So I think I think that sounds really nuts to a lot of neurohackers out there. But I think we should be very careful, because I use a metaphor of integrating the third ear with the third eye. And this is participatory, it is imaginal, it's not fantasy. And I think this is the difference, the crucial difference that Barfield is making clear in his work on Steiner and Goethe, and that there's a difference between fantasy and the imaginal, which is different from the imagination. And he draws on Coleridge here. Coleridge is, in the Ode to Dejection, is looking at a beautiful sunset, and I can't quote him exactly, but he's saying, I see, but do not feel how beautiful you are. I think this is a lament of the modern mind, that it can see the beauty out there, but it does not feel the beauty in here. And I think this is the structure of a phobia. And I think the modern mind is suffering from this split between the kinesthetic and the visual systems. And I think this is what Kingsley perhaps is touching upon too. But I'm getting way over my head here. I just wanted to back up a little bit. And, but I do want to address what you've brought up, Jeffrey, because I think it's very fascinating about the different uses of representation. And what we're talking about when we're talking about the representation varies so much. And I think that would be worth it for us to investigate those differences and how people are using representation and what is a symbol and what is symbolic. And I think these are the things that Barfield is really looking at. He's talking about the imaginal. And I don't know who coined that phrase. I think it may have been some other thinkers.
Corbin, I think, Henry Corbin.
Yeah. He's very sympathetic. I would think to Corbin. I don't know if you read Corbin, or Jung for that matter. But I think I just want to touch just briefly a paragraph from William Irwin Thompson, and he's talking about final participation. I hope this makes final participation a little bit clearer for us, because of course William Irwin Thompson's a contemporary thinker, and he knows a lot about cognitive psychology. So he says the imagination is like a transformer that takes electricity and steps it down to household current so that it can be used to run the appliances of our daily lives. And here I am using a metaphor to describe the metaphoric process through which the imagination takes in knowledge and steps it down into the conventional imagery of the sensory world with which we are familiar. Mystical knowledge, achieved through meditation, can sensitize us to consciousness without a sensory percept or a conceptual syntax. And this is traditionally called consciousness without an object, or samadhi. But the imagination is an intermediate realm, the realm of the artist, scientist, or prophet, who renders the intelligible into the sensible. And this is where he goes on to talk about Barfield. There is a form of prehistoric participation that Owen Barfield has discussed, in which identity is shared between subject and object, between unique and universal. We have to move from the prehistoric participation of the ancient mentality through the European modernist mentality with its linear system of perspective and its linear system of logic, fixed identity, and information processing, to a new planetary mentality in which a post-historic participation, or what Barfield called final participation, is the mesocosm that connects the microcosm of the bacterial bioplasm to the macrocosm of the atmosphere. There's a lot going on in that paragraph, but I think we are all sort of getting bits and pieces of this, getting different kinds of, getting a handle on that, like the blind people who are looking at the elephant, who are trying to sense the elephant, and you know, you get a bit of the tail, you get a tusk, you get the ear, you know, and you're trying to create some sort of composite figure from all of these different reports from people who do not have that visual sense. And so I think this is sort of what's going on here today. Thanks.
Just to come back, I totally agree with you on the other comments about, and mea culpa for using the body's machinery. It's a scientific shorthand that I use, and I agree with you that it's inappropriate. However, the point is that when we imagine, that when we image things in our mind, it's more about doing than representing. That's the point. It's a process of doing. There's no fundamental distinction between thinking in this way and actually acting, moving the body, moving, because we are moving in this slightly indirect way, but it's still moving rather than representing. That's the what I was trying to get at.
And that's a very good
I think
point.
you did understand it. But
I did get it, but it's slippery slope when we start talking about the machine and the mind.
Yeah, you're right.
We're embedded in a technological culture,
Yeah.
which sees everything as a machine.
And I'm still trying to unpack those things. So
Me too.
Some of those uncertainties or ambiguities will be in my expression, and there's no easy way to get rid of them. But
No, nor should you, Jeffrey. I just wanted to chime in there. John had asked, well, what is the eye? And it is the physical eye scans when we go through this process. And he said, and then you said, John, and this third eye, it's the metaphor. Well, I don't know that it's a metaphor. Maybe it is. When you speak of the third eye, or when I think of the third eye, or when I think about other people who have talked about a third eye, in the sense that you're using it, I start getting a little closer to the potential and actual existence things. That's why I'm not sure it's a metaphor at that point. We also know, for example, that if you're learning to play a musical instrument, like a keyboard or scales, or I'm trying to figure out how to play a harmonica, I can practice without having an instrument in my hand. And I can improve my performance on the instrument simply by practicing without it, it's the doing. And it turns out the doing is a real doing, even though I'm not doing it, so to speak. And because it carries over then later. So there is something at work here that goes beyond what we up until this point have generally accepted as what is physical and what is mental, and how that interrelates with one another. So we're that's where I see the new ground that we're kind of traversing at the moment. There's more to it than that, but even Barfield does very subtly and very indirectly. But when I was scanning through the chapter again today, I noticed that that word process pops up more often than one would expect, and he is kind of emphasizing this process aspect. There's that doing component, not just a talking about it or a representational portion to it as well.
Yeah, this is music to my ears, because it has to do with movement of whatever kind. Movement, just movement, whether it's internal or external, very Taoist. But this original, from my perspective or experience, of this original, what I interpret, polarity of stillness and movement. And I imagine this as being a human being that's not like us way back when Bart was talking about, of them somehow in interacting with their environment, they have to be still but aware of movement. They have to move, and get away from things, or just the sensory movement around them in an environment of the storm or a breeze or the rain falling and stuff. And so participation synonymously, doing, those words to me come back to movement, whether that movement's inside of me, like Jeffrey talks about. Process is basically movement. Process itself is movement. And like Jeffrey said, I really thank you, Jeffrey, because sometimes when I'm talking about thinking and I'm trying to share my thinking with people, I'm relating to it very kinetically. This is what's moving inside my thoughts and feelings, and there's a direction, but I don't know for sure, but something's moving. There's a charge in the movement. There's a something's behind it that I know not what. And in terms of the mechanical machine, which I'm glad that we talked about, I think one of the problems with that metaphor is it's a static conceptualization of movement that we think we have control over, or we put ourselves that we're controlling by sitting into a car, a static thing that can move like our legs, but it's static. And so we get into the car and then we drive it and we think we're in control, but maybe not, because if you're like I experienced recently of driving, and I don't do much driving. I had a fortunate experience to use my sister's car, and I was freaked out of how many freaking people are on the road. And I had to work with the anxiety of, when I used to drive a lot, there seemed to be a lot of people, but I mean, I had parking lots. I'm going, where did all these objects come from? You know, and they're moving. So I'm glad that we brought up the point of entry of movement, because I think, and I feel, at this point, a lot of what I am experiencing is I'm in the phase of moving from a point in my life where I had a lot of vitality and stuff, and now I know the direction I'm moving sooner or later will be no more. And there is a movement, and I want to participate fully in what that's going to look like, and not just turn my head away from it. So thank you.
Well, also, as we're in a technological culture, which I think when we've covered this before in previous discussions, but a car is complicated. You know, the engine, the carburetor, the battery, the tailpipe, you know, you can take all the pieces apart and you can put them back together and you can understand it, as complicated as it is. Some people can, I can't. You can still drive a car without understanding any of that. But a body, the human body, is not complicated. It is complex. The human brain, the human brain is probably one of the most complex physical things on the planet. So I think we're trying to simplify so much through our technology so that we can predict and control. And I think that reductive tendency is to mistake the complicated, the complex for the complicated. And that will doom us to extinction very soon if we continue in this course. Because ecologies, economies, bodies, self-organizing systems are inherently, intrinsically unpredictable and creative. But also destruction and creation, you know, are strange bedfellows sometimes. And there may be what many people are just saying is all just random. They may just have a very, very partial view and a very mechanical view, and trying to make something that's extremely complex simpler than it actually is. And I think that's where we're in this this participatory final participation phase, and the aperspectival or the integral. I think these are and the imaginal. I think we're all doing the best that we can with what we've got, and using this medium, the internet, in a way that is enhances our collaborative intelligence rather than fragments our egos until they can no longer serve anything. I think, except for the status quo. And I think this is the challenge. Can the ego become a servant rather than a master?
Yeah, exactly. exactly.
And I think this is why we don't want to annihilate the ego sitting on our meditation cushions, just entering into samadhi. And I think that's where I think Thompson and many other people are saying the visionary is actually, it's an intermediate realm between the samadhi and between the physical and all the other systems, the human and other than human, that we can flourish with or compete with in a deadly battle. So I think that's why I'm so mournful of the birds, 2.9 billion vanishing from North America with their much more complex visual systems than ours. And what's vanishing with that is a vast intelligence, perhaps, that we're never going to be able to replace in any kind of way. So I think this is the kind of things that should haunt us and worry us. And we're moving, I think, I'm borrowing here from Zach Stein. Hopefully we can look at one of his essays I think would be very compatible to what we're doing today. But he's talking about moving from a pre-tragic to tragic to post-tragic. Can we move to a post-tragic society? And I think this is a challenge for us, so that we don't, fall into that postmodern pity pot kind of attitude where, oh, well, fuck it, I'm gonna die, we're all gonna die, what difference does it make? Let's just make a lot of money and break out the booze and have a ball. And most of our culture is immersed in this and feeds us endless images of, more and more and more. So I think this, there's another way though of being, I think that participatory aesthetic would be to look at the human as a, not in monetary terms or what can be commodified or how much you can consume, but what can you do with your imagination? And I think if we could sponsor that rather than be addicted to these, these force-fed educational systems that we've all mourned for, how horrible the things that we've had to endure in these factory model educations, to another way of using our cognition and our affective and working with these liminal zones. So,
Well, John, can I ask you a
sponsor
question?
that, I think that'd be great. Sure, please do. Anytime.
It seems like, in hearing what you're saying, then there is a critical point of understanding the place the ego plays in participating. And because of trauma research, we also know that our egos then are formed in a less than healthy way of participating. I'll put it that way. So part of this getting the ego to be on board with participating in a healthy way that's how I use sitting on the cushion or walking meditation to support a healthy use of ego, because I agree the way it's been taught of trying to deny the ego, and I just learned that some of those practices, the way I look at them, is just helping me understand in a very, what can I say? Well, slow down process of how my ego got conditioned to react to everything. That's usually a resort of trauma. And so to move from a reactive ego to a more healthy, integrated, mature ego that wants to participate, but also knows it's not the king of the hill. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think that's something that I have been associated with, of listening to certain people from the Dharma world, really coming back and saying, no, it's not wrong to have an ego. It's not wrong. Get past that. But you have to learn how it is affecting how you participate. Because my understanding, John, the ego actually was formed through our survival mechanism. It literally came online because it comes online as a focus point of how the fuck do I survive? And we all know that in doing that, depending on the degree of trauma that people have, that there's baggage that comes with that. I'm in the midst right now of dealing with a nephew that got put in jail for domestic violence, and I'm trying to work with him of honor that I know his history and honor where he's at, and actually use this moment as a gift to change how he's been affected. Because he got drunk and he caused domestic violence, and I'm his uncle, and I told him, you need to stop that fucking shit. You need to get real. Because he's imitating his own father and my brother that had addiction problems. I'm sorry for my exuberance, but thank you for listening.
I love your first person, Michael. We need those
Oh, thanks.
first person expressions and bringing them into a personal space, so that we can blend first person, third person, second person. So I really appreciate
Yeah,
what you
and
just
you've helped me do that, John, and the whole group has. But just the way you language the value of that has helped too. So thank you.
Thank you.
I know we're running out of time, so to speak, but I wanted at least to touch on the title of this book, because we haven't talked about either appearances or idolatry. He calls the book Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry. And when Jeffrey, you and John had the little exchange about machinery, I thought, well, that's an example of idolatry, that we infuse the machine, technology in general, with a lot more value and power and meaning than maybe it deserves. And that this is actually in keeping with a history of idolatry, a kind of like this is something that we do as people. We infuse objects, things, so-called appearances, with powers that they may or may not have. And part of, I think, what final participation is, insofar as it's a critique of idolatry, is, and so I'm assuming he's seeing idolatry as something to be avoided, something that is a substitute kind of gratification or a substitute object for the real thing. If the real is the infinite or the divine being, or however you construe that. But it also brought to mind Nietzsche, whose one of his books is called Twilight of the Idols, and in which Nietzsche critiques, deconstructs a whole series of intellectual and religious ideas. And one of them is the relation between the true world and the apparent world. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but at the end of one of these sections, he says the true world, meaning the world of non-appearances, the world behind appearances, the world in itself, or in Christian terms, God's, the world of the infinite, the world of God, as opposed to our particular perceptions. We have abolished, he says. What world has remained? The apparent one, perhaps, but no. With the true world, we have also abolished the apparent one. And he sees this as a great achievement, actually, that we deconstruct the apparent duality between what's real and what's perceived, what's in itself and what's for us. And so, not having read the entirety of Barfield's book, I'm only guessing at the elephant, through maybe grabbing one part of its body. But this theme of idolatry, which I think again connects to, in our age, technology, which I assume that this was also on their minds, is I think something we should at least touch on. And just by way of another and final comment. Actually, I'll hold. Let me come back to that. I want to hear what you guys think about that first.
Well, I find that what you said to be true, because I just read the chapter, and then I went to Amazon, and they let you read so much in the introduction, and I think you're right. The subtitle kind of is pointing to using Christian terms of idolatry to point to how we're being affected by the environment. In his case, at the time, during the wars, I think that may have really made an impact on him of seeing how much the idolatry was playing into how we were being inhuman with each other. You know, the context of all those writers or what they lived through just bleeds through everything they write, I feel.
Yeah, can I just throw in one line there in the text that I provided where some of those definitions were given. In there, Barfield says that idolatry may be defined as the valuing of images or representations in the wrong way and for the wrong reasons, and an idol as an image so valued. More particularly, idolatry is the effective tendency to abstract the sense content from the whole representation and seek that for its own sake, transmuting the admired image into a desired object. This tendency seems always to have been latent in original participation, and if we could peer deep enough into the foundations of the world, we might find it written there that alpha thinking itself, that's direct, straightforward thinking, is one of the forms it takes, perhaps the noblest, certainly the subtlest and the most lasting form. At all events, the word idol has long come to denote not the image as such, but the image on its way to becoming an object. And I think it's the objectification, it's the detachment, it's the making a thing of it and not recognizing it for what it truly is, and that, in his turn, as that which has been created, that which is always there. It's been there before we were there. We piece this together and should recognize in that piecing together the source of that we're piecing together. But when we idolatrize that, we detach it from that. We make it an object, and then it's something we can manipulate. He doesn't have, his whole idea about dashboard knowledge is all about technology, and that's the one side of science where you just make it do things, and so you can do whatever you want with things, but you don't. And so you can destroy the world, or you can have the ecological crisis that we have today. You can do all of those things because what's to stop you? You have so detached yourself from the things that you are looking at that they no longer have any real meaning for you. And so they become truly objectified in that sense. And so saving the appearances is one of those things, because that's just the appearance. And so we construct our way of we have to figure a way of dealing with that, even when we recognize that it's not that way, because I have to explain to everyone else that I'm talking, that I'm engaged with, that maybe you shouldn't just see it as an object. Maybe you're more, I think I sense that's part of that whole interconnectedness debate that is going on, how much we are connected and interrelated with one another. And, we're all, from Sagan's, we're all stardust to, we are one another in the end. And so we need to be a little more careful about how we do that. But at the same time, we have to explain our own relationship to the world. And that's the appearances part. And so these are appearances. So we haven't gotten to the reality yet. We always deal with the appearances. And he's saying we need to consciously move through that to engage not just actual reality, but the potential reality that's behind that as well.
I just want to briefly add to that, moving through. So it's seeing through the frame rather than getting stuck in the frame. The idea that Simone Weil said, lust is the desire to eat what you should only look at. I think Diotima, the wise woman, in the symposium, she's talking to Socrates about love, and she says, "There's the erotic love of a beautiful person. You mature, hopefully, in a certain direction so that you can release the object of your affections. And you can appreciate that there's something beyond. And that eroticism that gets caught up in sex, there's a different kind of eroticism. And I think that's what Plato is pointing out when he, and what Dayatoma is saying. Men do not want beauty. They want to create beauty. They want to give birth to beauty. That's what she said. Men want to give birth to beauty, which is a very radical thing to say, for a woman to say to a man in such a profoundly patriarchal warrior society as the Greek society was. So that's what's been triggered by your question, Marco, and thank you. I think you got something there. Yeah.
Yeah, this has been very interesting, and I'm reminded by that of this dialectic of subject and object, of one of the formulas for summarizing developmental psychology, which is that the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. In other words, what one is identified with, one disidentifies with, it becomes object. But then there's a third movement, which is to integrate with it, which is to no longer, to be fused, to be differentiated, and to be integrated. And I think that that's part of what Plato was describing in terms of the ascent of Eros, through different forms of expression.
And Barfield too. I think that's what final participation is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all.
And he's also arguing, I think, against let's call it the mechanistic scientific perspective, right? So he says in this second section, page 54, let us see, for instance, what consequences flow from adopting the first view, namely that scientific theories are simply hypotheses to save the appearances. Huh? And then he talks about Bacon, and this is very much in view of my own reading of the history of science, because the Cartesian revolution, the event that we call the Cartesian revolution, which led to the split between body and mind in our understanding of the world, was actually the first part of the revolution. The second part was Bacon's contribution, which was, in order to undertake science, you prod nature, and then you record what comes back after you've prodded nature, which is, of course, the ecological disaster within which we are sitting, right? Because we have prodded nature so far that the kickback is going to kill us, right? So, but it's part of the origins of the scientific project, the second part, and Barfield is speaking directly to that issue here. So, and using the term serving the appearances, which is the title of the book. So I think this is also an argument. It's not just about going beyond this kind of thinking, yes. It's also recognizing that this is built into our culture and the way we function in today's world.
I think that's an excellent point, Jeffrey, and it's probably a good point to end on, since we are getting close to, well, we're over our time, but we're not over our time if we count it when we started, when John showed up. So we actually are on time. Does anybody have any final comments that they want to throw out here to enlighten us all before we go our separate way?
I just want to say that this conversation has really helped me articulate not only what I read, but what I hold dear in my heart.
I'm really thrilled that we have this technology that can record this collaborative group effort as we wrestle with the words and the meanings of these great thinkers, because I could never remember what all of us said, no matter how good my notes are. So, but I would remember a feeling, a strong feeling, but I wouldn't get any of the details. So I think it's great. And I know there's so much that I missed that went over my head, that each of you offered, because I think that there's considerable amount of complexity in this conversation. But I also think that it's been a very grounded conversation. And it's been said that Barfield was, he said that his ideas would not be understood in his lifetime, but about 50 years after he predicted around now. He's been dead, I think, 20 years. But I think that I think there's a lot here we could go over and sift through this again, and in future conversations we could elaborate even further, because I think we've just barely skimmed the surface here. Thanks.
Okay. I think I had an insight into Jesus through something you said earlier, Michael. I'm going to not share it now because otherwise I think we'd have to keep going. But something about final and mortality, I think you only touched on that. And I think that something about the kind of intentional, the act of death becoming a symbol for something beyond itself maybe has some relation to that connection. That's all. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
See you next
Have
time.
a good day, wherever you are.
And a good evening.
Wherever you are.